The silence after the dragon was the loudest thing Jon could remember. In the great wound of the hall, winter's breath moved uninvited through broken stone and ribs of iron, stirring a drift of ash into the air until it glittered and faded. The blades of the throne had fused down one side, warped into black lacquer where dragonfire had licked. A shard of sword jutted like a finger accusing him. A man's voice coughed in the back of his mind, Ned, or Gior, or a dozen dead captains, saying nothing and everything. He had not wept. The tears were not for him. He had held her. The warmth of her blood had found its way beneath his fingers and into the lines of his palm like a script written in heat and guilt. He had said the words he could not recall, and she had stilled, and then the world had come apart as if it were waiting to be told to do so. Drogon, bewildered, grieving, had mourned with a sound like mountains cracking, and then the dragon had gone, bearing what bed of flame could not consume. Grey Worm had not spoken. He had looked at Jon as if Jon were a problem that would be solved by a spearpoint and exactness. The Unsullied moved like doors closing. Jon had expected the stroke. He had been ready, if ready was a thing a man could be for his own ending. Instead, the spears had remained upright, a corral rather than a grave, and time had thinned and spread. Perhaps even iron discipline could not step that quickly into the space where a dragon had been. There was ash in Jon's mouth and on his tongue, and the taste had no season. He closed his eyes and the hall was Winterfell in spring, damp wool and wood smoke, Arya darting with a stick sword, the courtyard mud sucking at boots. He opened them and found only ruin. He thought of the bells that had been rung too late, of the women bent over their dead, of the small boy he'd seen on the steps with a charred toy in his hand that had been a knight, a pig, something once. Davos came. Jon heard the sound of boots scuffing ash before the man himself took shape from all the gray. The Onion Knight moved with the weariness of a ship that had weathered a bad sea and wanted only a quiet harbor. "Your Grace," Davos said, and then, with a wince at his own mouth, "Jon." "Don't," Jon said. He looked at the spear points and the faces beyond them. He did not know how to speak to men who had chosen to unlearn obedience to anything but the next command. "Not that." Davos said softly. He had dried blood at the braid of his beard and a fissure at the corner of his lip that had bled and closed and would open again if he smiled. He did not smile. "We have a city to keep alive long enough to bury it." The ash fell, and beyond the ragged wall the sea showed a dull flank through smoke. A raven sliced the sky. Tyrion came up from the stair like a man climbing out of an old story, pale as flower dust, hands bound loosely with leather, a pair of Unsullied at his follow. He looked at the dark shape where iron and heat had made some new thing, and he stopped and lifted his face, drawing in the cold. "She's gone," he said. There was no surprise in him, only a tiredness that matched the room. "Of course she is. She is dead," Grey Worm said at last, voice a blade that had been sharpened to a humming line. "By his hand." Tyrion turned to Jon, and their eyes found one another. The bond there had survived other rooms and other mornings, and it held. "Then say it," Tyrion told him, quiet and hard. "Say it where they can hear." Jon let the air out of his chest and watched it turn to mist. He did not lift his voice. He spoke for the room and for the broken kingdom it contained. "I killed Daenerys," he said. "I loved her and I killed her. She would not stop." The words hung like frost. They were simple. There was no honor in them, only necessity. He had tried to find a path between love and duty and discovered there was only a blade hidden in the grass. Grey Worm took one measured step forward. His men did likewise, spears shifting on invisible strings. Davos reached for his sword and did not draw it. The hall was too hot with something other than fire for steel. Tyrion moved between the spear points and Jon without quite moving at all, a half-step that seemed accidental and was not. "What you do next," Tyrion said to all of them and to none, "determines if the city sees a winter, let alone a spring." "We obeyed," Grey Worm said, and in his mouth obedience was a sacred word. "She was our queen, and now she is dead and the living remain," Davos said. "We can set about killing them, or we can give them bread." Jon lifted his gaze to the broken ceiling. The sky was widening. He thought of the oaths he had said and broken and said again, of walls made of ice and of men whose lives were measured in footfalls across snow that had no end. He was not wise. He was only the sum of what he'd done and what he'd failed to do. He could not give the dead back their mournings. He could, perhaps, keep more from joining them. That thought was not enough, but it was what he had. "Lay down your spears," Jon told Grey Worm. "Not for me. For them." He pointed beyond the ribs of the wall at the city bent and smoking. "As long as I draw breath, they will not be slaughtered for what we cannot undo." "And if I do not lay them down?" Grey Worm asked, level as a board. "Then you will kill me and take a city of ashes and keep it," Jon said. "And you will spend every day of your life holding it against ghosts." Something moved in Grey Worm's face then, a small muscle beneath the eye, the twitch of a man remembering a lesson from a very early morning long ago. He did not lower his spear. He turned instead and gestured. The Unsullied's points remained high, but the ring widened. The hall breathed. Jon let his shoulders fall. Winter had taught him to be grateful for small things that kept a man alive. He looked again at the throne, at what was left of it. There were blades that had belonged to men of the Reach and of the North, men whose names had been beaten out of them, men whose wives had cut bread with knives that had once been true steel and then had become this. The crown, he thought suddenly. There was no crown. All the pieces of rule in this room had been turned strange. Perhaps that was right. Perhaps no single chair deserved to demand so much blood. The city stirred beyond the keep, a sound like the sea taking a long breath. Jon felt it in his bones, and the hollowness shifted and made room for a decision. He did not climb the steps to the throne because there were no steps. He did not kneel because there was no one to kneel to. He walked to the center of the ruined room, found a flat of stone that had been a stair once, and stood where a man could be seen. "Hear me," he said, and his voice went farther than he expected it to, the cold carrying it. "I will answer for what I have done. But until the dead have candles and the living have bread, I will not lay down this charge. By my name as Jon Snow, and by the name my blood gives me, I will keep this city from the sword. If any man thinks to take the lives of those who survive today to avenge those who did not, he will find me between them." Davos's breath fogged. Tyrion's eyes were bright, which might have been tears or might have been the wind. Grey Worm watched, a statue that had been told to feel and did not remember how. Outside, a bell that had been cracked in the heat tried itself on the morning. It made a sound like a broken promise. It was a beginning. The city tried to refuse them. It had closed its alleys and put men with knives in its dark. It had stacked timbers across streets so that carts could not pass, and the carts that had passed had cracked their wheels and given up like old men. Still the North came in and the Vale came in, steady and quiet and careful as snow filling a field. The men rode with their chins tucked into scarves and their eyes level. They did not sing. They looked at what had been done and kept their spear points down, and that, too, was a mercy. Sansa had acquired new ways in Winterfell. There was a carriage somewhere for her, a proper thing with brass corners, sheathed in canvas to keep out weather. She did not ride in it. She came on a white horse that had seen dirt and fear and remained a horse, and she sat it with a queen's back. Her hair was braided. The red of it shone even through dust. When she halted at the courtyard of the keep, what was left of it, she did not dismount immediately. She looked instead. She took the measure of the ovens Davos had set with huntsman's cunning, saw the lines of women with their sleeves rolled and their faces blank as plates, saw the buckets of water going and the dirty hands coming back, and she nodded once, as if to the idea of bread itself. Arya stood with the horse's rein loosely in her hand, glove worn to the seam at the thumb. She had worn so many faces lately that her own had settled like a coin at the bottom of a well, hard to see and always there. Her gaze scanned edges. She was restless in stillness, remade into something that did not wait comfortably. When a boy lost his loaf to a jostle and began to cry silently because he had finished his tears in the last days, Arya bent without being told and hunkered, and when she rose the boy was eating with both hands. "You made it," she said when Jon came down to them with ash in his beard, and she did not mean the city. I made it, he said, and the words were heavier than they should have been. He looked at Sansa and found winter in her, and also the hearth fire that had always turned to welcome when the door opened at last. He did not try to smile. There is work. There always is, Sansa said. Her eyes went past him to the broken gullet of the keep, to the room where a thing had been decided that could never be undecided. She closed her mouth and opened it again. Have you told them? They know enough, Jon said. The rest, Grey Worm will not leave. Not yet. The Dothraki have gone to the roads. Sansa's gloved hand brushed the horse's neck. The animal's skin shivered. And you? I stood where a king would stand, Jon said, and saw the small frown that was both irritation and worry take her brow. I did not wear a crown. There was none. There is always a crown, Sansa said, even when it is not on a table. She swung down from the horse at last and pulled her cloak around her shoulders. If you mean to keep them alive, then you mean to rule. If you mean to rule, you must make the first decree a true one. She looked at him, and for a moment her face was the small girl's face he remembered, the one that had believed in songs with both hands. Then it was gone, and there was only the woman who had been made by hunger and cruelty and cold. The Lannisters. He had known the word would come. It had been circling all morning like a bird that mistook smoke for cloud. Tyrion was in a room with a door that stuck where the frame had warped, watched by two northern men who had the decency to look at the floor when he looked back. The name Lannister still had weight in the city. It had the weight of stones falling and of wine poured on a floor slicked with blood. In the alleys, men cursed it with careful mouths. In the houses, women said it quietly as if it would come in if called. I have not given judgment, Jon said. You do not have time to listen to every wrong ever done them or by them, Sansa said. But the realm will not come to heel while that lion hangs anywhere. It binds fear to memory. She lifted her chin toward the west, as if the rock itself could hear them. Exile them, across the sea. If they will not go, send them underground instead, and be done. Arya's eyes flicked to Sansa, then back to Jon. He is your friend, she said, and did not bother to soften it with question or pretend. She meant anyone other than the man with clever eyes who had taught Jon how to laugh again. Friends, Jon said, and tasted the word like salt. I have killed a woman. He swallowed. There is no good ground left, only ground we can use. He looked up at the long tear that Dragonfire had cut through stone. The sky beyond was the cleaner blue of cold mornings in the north, when the snow made everything honest. I will call a council, not of great lords, of those who are here and can lift and carry and build. It will not be a sentence given in a closet. It will be a decree given to the air. Sansa studied him. If you mean to break the wheel, she said, you must pry its spokes out in daylight where everyone can see the nails coming out. Davos's ovens breathed. The smell of bread was a kind of pardon in the courtyard. It cut through ash and the stink of bricks that had boiled. Jon drew it into his lungs and felt something unclench. Then we begin, he said. They found a table that had been a door, set it on two barrels with hoops like belts, and knocked a pin in to keep it from wobbling. Men and women of the city stood with flour on their hands, with soot in the hair they had not yet cut away from their faces. The few lords who had survived were nothing finer in that place. Brienne came with a smear of mortar at her cheek and the Baratheon black and gold casting a stubborn bruise over her shoulder where she had planted a banner in broken stone that morning. Gendry stood beside her, his hands raw, a lord who still had a smith's grip. Yara Greyjoy arrived as if the air had owed her passage, salt in her braid and eyes like wet slate, and if she had counted the guards at every entrance, she did not advertise it. Tyrion was brought, not in chains now, though the leather that had bound him had left sleeping red lines on his wrists. He took in the makeshift council and the flour-smeared small folk and the barrels making dew as pillars and inclined his head the smallest measure. It's a start, he said. Jon placed his hands on the wood. He thought of the old gods who had never wanted altars, who had preferred the noise of leaves and a brook's patience. "By blood and by need," he said. "I hold this city until a better hand can take it or the seven fall out of the sky and choose one. In the name of the people who have suffered under it, I decree that House Lannister leave the capital and the crown's lands and be gone from this realm by the turning of 2 moons. No man or woman of that name will hold office in this city again. Their gold belongs to their creditors first, and to the rebuilding of these streets second. Their lives belong to them, and may be spent across the sea as they choose." There was a sound from the gathered, somewhere between a sigh and a murmur, the noise a wound makes when it is lanced. Tyrion did not flinch. His mouth made its old shape for a jest and settled into something else. "You are kinder than most kings," he said. "I am not a king," Jon answered. "You are whatever the city must call you to obey and not collapse," Tyrion said, and something like a smile came and went. "If exile is what buys their peace, then I will go, and I will take the lion with me." Grey Worm came then to the edge of the crowd, and the look he gave Jon was a measure of the distance between them. He spoke in the common tongue without warmth. "We will not kneel, but we will not cut the throats of baker women to prove that we can. We will stay until the ships you promised are built. Then we go." "To Noth," Davos said. Grey Worm's face turned the smallest degree toward him. "We keep our word." "So do we," Jon said. "The docks will have carpenters before the sun sets twice." "A hard decree, Jon," Sansa said when they had broken and the people had gone to turn decrees into lifting and rope. "But the right one." Arya watched Tyrion walk away with his thoughts like knives under his cloak. "The right thing has a cost. We'll pay it." "Everyone will," Jon said. He had not felt like a king when he spoke. He did not feel like one now. He felt like a man who had chosen from among bad choices the one that cut least close to the heart and knew the knife would find it later anyway. He looked past them to the mangled horizon, and for a moment his tired mind showed him snow falling thick on rough stone, and the sound of a direwolf snuffling in his hair. He put his hand on his chest where the fur lay, and under it his heart beat its slow, stubborn measure. "We will do the work in front of us," he said. "Then we will do the next." When the council had emptied into the labor that would prove whether councils meant anything, Tyrion remained, looking at the torn fabric of a banner that had lost its device. He ran his thumb along the edge of the cloth as if the stringing thread could tell him a story he'd missed. Jon came to stand beside him, not close. There were distances that could not be crossed in a single afternoon. "You could have had my head," Tyrion said, not looking up. "It would have made a great many people applaud, and a few weep. You have chosen to share in my unpopularity. Courage or idiocy, they do wear a similar face." "What I did this morning," Jon said, "wore both." Tyrion lifted his gaze. "You will send me away, from this city, from your side. If I argued, I would only make it more likely." He blew out a soft breath that might have been a laugh. "It will be an odd thing, to live without always trying to keep my head attached to my neck by elegantly arranged words." "You will live," Jon said. "That is not nothing." "No." Tyrion glanced at the doorway where a boy swept as if a clean sweep might be found beneath stones. "It's not nothing." He straightened the remnants of his coat as if they were silk. "I will go to Pentos or to a place with fewer memories and better wine. Casterly Rock will empty of those whose name puts knives in men's hands. The rock will still stand, of course. It was always more obstinate than we were. There will be those who curse me for sending you away," Jon said. "I will not argue with them, but I could not keep you in a city that needs to forget the shape of your name." Tyrion's smile was a cut this time. "It is a very particular shape." He tilted his head, studied Jon's face with a craftsman's interest. "You are wearing it, you know? The shape of a man who says no to his own desires until the word has eaten a hole through him. Do not make a feast of yourself for duty. Even kings are allowed to eat bread." "I am not a—" "Yes," Tyrion said gently. "We know." They walked the broken colonnade, stepping over chunks of dressed stone that lay like molars wrenched from an old jaw. Ghost came with them, noiseless as fog. He had found Jon in the night the way he always had, as if some thread between them glowed in darkness. His fur was singed at one flank. The pink of new skin showed. He bumped Jon's hand with his head, and Jon's fingers sank into fur like a man finding earth under his boots after too long on a rolling deck. "You will need a council that contradicts you," Tyrion said as they came to the place where you could see the river make its brown argument around black boats. "Davos to tell you where the water will betray you. The tall knight from the Sapphire Isle to make you think twice about sending boys to die for your throne that isn't. A healer with ink on his fingers to remind you that ignorance is more expensive than libraries. A woman who has commanded ships and will tell you plainly when your plans will sink." "Brienne," Jon said softly. "Sam, Yara, and Sansa," Tyrion added, "who has learned to read cruelty so that she can keep it from her hearth. Listen to her even when it feels like swallowing nettles." "I will," Jon said. Down on the river, a carp flapped in oily water where ash had fallen. The wind shifted. A light rain began, not strong enough to wash anything clean, only to settle dust into the lines of men's faces. Tyrion blinked, and the wet made his eyes young for a heartbeat. "When I am gone," he said, "they will whisper that it was you who spared me, or that it was your sister, whom they will conjure alive to fit the story. Let them. The realm runs on the grease of rumor and on the axle of what men do when they are certain they will not be thanked for it." Jon nodded. "Take what you need," he said. "Ships, bread. If there are children of that name, see that they are seen to. Let the old wrongs be buried with their old men." "Mercy," Tyrion murmured. "We have all killed for lack of it. Perhaps we might try to live with an excess." He stopped and put a hand inside his vest. When it came out, there was a small volume wrapped in leather that had seen better days and worse winters. He held it out. "I stole this long ago from a maester who did not deserve it. It is full of things we have already learned with blood. Keep it. It will save you some wounds." Jon took the book and felt its weight, which was slight and still somehow more than his hand expected. The stitching had been repaired twice. "You always did have a gift for leaving a man with a burden." "I try," Tyrion said, and for a breath the old humor sparked through like a coal. Then it was gone. "I'll send a raven when we make shore. If you should ever desire to sail west of maps, you will find an unwise dwarf ready to do the navigation." Jon almost smiled. "Go on, then, before I change my mind." "I was going to say the same to you," Tyrion replied and bowed. A proper court bow out of a court that had been burned to cinder. "Rule well, Jon Snow, or at least rule less badly than those who came before. It would be a novelty." He turned and went, and the ash fell, and Ghost watched him with the mild indifference of a quiet god. By the third day, a wind came up from the sea that did not stink of charcoal and grief. It had a salt mouth and a stranger's hands. It pushed the clouds thin and combed the harbor into ordered lines. And in that brief reprieve Davos bullied cedars and oaths into ships that would float long enough to get men to where they could walk again. The carpenters sang, and their voices were cracked and small and stubborn. Tyrion stood on the quay with a rolled bundle that contained whatever a man thought he could not leave behind. Slips of paper with names, a knife with a bone handle, a copper that had purchased his first drink after a whipping. He looked smaller than Jon remembered and, somehow, more present. Perhaps exile made a man into his outline. "Do not wait for me," Tyrion said, when the moment had come to put a foot on the gangplank. "You have a city to argue with. It will be louder than I am and more persistent." "I have never found anything more persistent than you," Jon said. "Except winter." "Ah," Tyrion said, "you will discover they are cousins." Grey Worm watched from a distance, unspeaking as always, his men a dark hedge. He had accepted the ships with a crisp nod and an economy of words that would have made a banker proud. He had stood as Tyrion walked past and had not moved, and for a heartbeat the two had been mirrors of men who had obeyed orders until obeying had become the only language they spoke. Yara held a rope at the bow of her own craft and spat into the sea with an expression of family affection. "We'll sail when the tide does," she called without being asked. "Queen in the north," Tyrion said, as if testing the weight of the title the way he could not help testing everything. Sansa stood a little apart at the head of the quay, wrapped in a cloak lined in gray wool. The rain slicked her hair to her temple. She did not wave. She inclined her head, and Tyrion returned it, and the river between them was full of things unsaid and unnecessary. Arya appeared like a shadow unpeeling from a wall and stepped to Jon's side without looking at him. She smelled of wet leather and tar and steel. "He'll live," she said, almost to herself. "He will," Jon said, "and we'll see him again when the road is not expecting us." Arya's mouth made the shape of something like contentment. "There are places on maps I haven't walked yet." "You could stay," Jon said, and the moment was a small shelter they stood under together while the rain made lace on the water. "I could," she agreed, and the words were not a promise of anything. She leaned into him, just enough to make a weight he felt through fur and wool and skin, and then away again. "Don't let them build you another chair of swords," she said. "You'll only bleed to humor it." Davos shouted, "Cast off," in a voice that could be heard by cormorants. Lines were tossed. The ship heaved its shoulders and turned with the current, the river taking it like a patient mother takes a child who does not know he is being moved. Tyrion raised a hand. Jon returned it. That was all. Exiles do not get the theater of farewell unless they purchase it with tragedy, and they had paid enough. When the ship had become a toy on the brown water and then a ghost on the gray, Jon stood until his hair dripped and his bones voiced their old complaints. Ghost shook himself, and the spray that came off him smelled clean for the first time in days. Jon scratched him between the ears without looking, and Ghost leaned into his hand with infinite patience. "Now the hard part," Davos said, arriving like a tide without a wave. "Not dying is always the easy part. Living through it after, that's where a man discovers if he's got the stomach." Jon glanced at him. "I thought that was your way of asking for more lumber." "It is," Davos said gravely. "And rope and leather and 200 men who can tell the difference between a knot that will hold and a knot that will land them all on the bottom. Also 1,000 loaves and 1,000 more and—" Jon let the list wash over him until it became a kind of litany. He nodded in the right places. The rain thinned. Across the anchorage, the Unsullied moved in blocks, precise as if marching across pages in a book. Grey Worm directed with small motions of his hand, and men carried wood as if it were honor. He would leave, he had said, and Jon believed him. Some men had only the forward gear left in them. "Tonight," Jon said at last, "we call the people to the square below the September. We give the names of the dead to the air. We give the living soup and oil for lamps." "Oil is dear," Davos said automatically. "So is grief," Jon answered. "We can't afford either, but we pay them." Davos studied him with that look that had earned him 100 stripes and a handful of sons who had died on water to make the world safe for men with softer hands. "I," he said, and the word made the air warmer by a degree. They read the names until the night itself grew tired of hearing them. They read them until lamps went out in the wind and were relit by hands that remembered how to make small continuances. The square had been pitted by fire. Its stones drank heat the way parched men drink sour wine. Men and women stood shoulder to shoulder because there was nowhere else to be. After a time, some sat where their legs told them to sit, and no one scolded them. The names kept going. Names from Flea Bottom that had never belonged to a ledger. Names that had filled rosters for great houses and were now only breath on the air. "Brother, wife, mother, little bear," said a girl in a voice fierce enough to break the sky, and someone near her made a small sound that might have been a laugh and might have been a sob. Jon held his lamp and thought of a weirwood whose face had watched him grow and had not changed. The flames made the white trunk into a living thing that exhaled, inhaled. He found, to his surprise, that he could bear standing still when he should have wanted to flee. Perhaps the act of naming was a kind of setting down. He did not speak Daenerys' name, though it came into his throat like smoke. It was a grief for a different square, and he would not steal this night for it. Sansa's fingers had gone waxy where the candle's metal warmed them. She flexed them once and quietly handed her lamp to a woman whose palms knew work. "Tomorrow we open the storehouse," she said, pitched low for Jon and Davos and a small circle of breath. We ration by house, not by hand. If men can count their children to get more, they'll become fathers overnight. Arya, a team of watchers at each disbursement, Arya said. 2 from here, 2 from the north, 2 from the Vale. If they flinch when a knife shows, move them off. I'll take the knife showers. You always do, Sansa said, and they might have been in a kitchen in Winterfell the way their voices found the old rhythm. Brienne, I'll set a watch with my own knights, Brienne said. She used the word with discomfort. It had not sat well in her mouth, but it had not fallen out. No man uses the line for food as a chance to make himself bigger. He can make himself smaller if he wants to leave on his feet. Gendry, Davos said. The city needs handles that won't break. Get men to the smithies that still stand. Make nails and hooks and repairs for carts. If a cart's wheel breaks, we lose 20 loaves to the ground. I know wheels, Gendry said, and the way he said it contained a whole childhood of making things round and hoping they would carry something that mattered. And you? Arya asked Jon, not lifting her eyes from the dark beyond the lamps. What will you do when the last name is Reed and the last loaf is eaten? I will sleep, maybe, Jon said, and the lie was gentle. And when I wake, I will listen to men argue whether a temple should be rebuilt before a bridge, and then decide something that will make both of them angry. I will walk to the river and stand where it smells least like a forge and remember that once there were trees here. I will think about ships for men who do not belong here any longer and ships for grain that does. I will send letters to lords who despise me and ask them for more than they want to give. And I will kill anyone who comes for you before I am done with them, Arya said, in a voice that belonged to winter and to a little girl with a stick. Do not, Sansa said, and in that small word was the steel that had outlasted every blade that had tried it. We will not survive another rule by blood alone. Jon, when you are finished listening to the men who like to hear themselves, listen to the women who do not. He inclined his head to her. I will. The names went on. An old man fell asleep standing against Brienne's arm and woke with a start and blushed and then laughed, and the laugh went through the crowd like a ripple of warmer water. At last the scroll's end came as all ends do, without ceremony and with the sense that there was another list somewhere the light could not reach. The wind stilled. Jon lifted his lamp, and so did the others. We remember, he said. The words were not new. They grew no thinner from being used. The lamps went out one by one, and the dark came up like a tide. The square emptied slowly, with good nights that were not quite lies. Ghost rose and stretched and yawned very wide, and Arya grinned in spite of herself. He looks like a wolf again, she said. He always was, Jon answered, and watched the dark for a time without seeing it as enemy or friend. It was simply something that came and could be endured. In the west, the rock endured as it always had, untroubled by the names of the men who lived within it. The sea gnawed at its base with the persistence of time, and time would always win, but no one living would see it. The Lannisters had raised wine to that endurance for centuries. They had carved songs into its hallways and love into its beds and cruelty into its favor. Now the banner came down, and the hook it hung on felt the weight leave its throat and did not care. Ser Martin Lannister, who had been nobody until he had become nobody again, stood with his hand on the head of a child and did not say the things that would make this easier. He had lived long enough to understand that there were days you only walked through. His cousin's daughter, Ellen, who had inherited red hair like a pennant and eyes that had not learned to think before they looked, clutched the lion she had been given when she turned 5 and had her ears pierced with cried dignity. Will we come back? She asked, which was what children still believed in when they had not yet lost their first teeth to a negligent blow. If the sea forgets the rock, Ser Martin said, we will come back. It was a poor joke, and he could hear that in his own mouth, but Ellen smiled because she liked the shape of the words. Old Lady Rhea, who remembered a wedding where the bride had broken her shoe at the 3rd dance and laughed and danced the 4th in one stocking, made the sign for warding that she did not admit to making. They'll strip it, she said. Gaze up at the honeycomb of windows where light had gone out in rooms where men had scolded boys for idleness. They'll take the gold out of the walls and call it taxes. Let them, Martin said, and surprised himself. He had not known he could still mean a thing that much. He looked down the long turn of the road, where men were carrying bundles that had once been reputations. A boy had a sword in a wrap of old velvet. It would not make him any larger when his feet hit a foreign dock. "We will be alive," he said. "We will remember the taste of the water here and always compare it unfairly to the water there. We will teach our children songs they will not understand and hope that someday their children will come to a land that quiets the noise in them the way this cliff did for us." He had expected to be angry. He found instead that he was tired, and that the tiredness was not something he could sleep away. At the gate, a guard who had grown up under a lion and had learned to watch with a lion's certainty stood with his spear set and his eyes raw. "Sire," the man said, and did not say "I am sorry," which would have been too large and too small. "Keep the stones from falling," Martin said. "That is all any of us were ever doing." They descended, and the sea's voice grew until it was the only thing that mattered. The ship below had 3 masts and the lines of a vessel that knew how to leave rather than how to arrive. Pentassi lanterns burned with a color the rock did not recognize. Ellen's hair blew across her face and she did not brush it away. She kept her lion in both hands as if she were grasping not just an animal but an idea. At the quay, a boy from Lannisport with his father's hands frowned at a list and told them where to stand and when to move, and a woman from across the bay whose husband had gone to fight a war she had not been consulted about told the children where to put their feet, and for an hour or two they were simply people trying to put themselves in an order that would not collapse. Martin watched the rock through the gathering gray until it became a silhouette against a sea that would outlive all of them. He bowed to it, a soldier's bow that admitted defeat without shame. "We will be better over there," he lied to Ellen softly. "We will be clever, and we will not turn into men who break other men's doors to prove something to themselves." Ellen nodded as if she had understood. "Will there be lions there?" she asked. "Only the ones we take," he said, and touched the small charm in her fist. "Hold fast to yours." The Nathi ships left on a morning that smelled of copper and lemon oil. The sea had forgiven the city enough to bring some of its old songs back. Rope creaked, and that sound had never belonged to grief. Gray worms stood on the prow as if the water were merely an extension of the deck, an enemy he would eventually teach to obey. His face did not move. It had learned the trick of stillness in a school that had no scarves to hide in. The men behind him stood as he stood, and in their stares was the long promise of a place where no captain would shout at them in a language of conquest. Davos had argued ships into being and then into leaving. He had gone to the carters with rope and to the rope makers with coin and to the coin with a voice that made it imagine it couldn't be anything else but spent. Now he stood on the pier with his cap in his hands and watched the ships go with the old ache in his chest that never quite became a cough. "He'll keep his word," he said to Jon without looking at him. "He is made of it. Men like that fall apart when there's nothing to obey, but a promise is still a command." "He will find a place where the wind does not order him," Jon said, and tried to imagine such a place and failed. He wondered what Noth smelled like. He had only the word to go on and a story told by a girl with eyes like lamps. Yara's longship cut away from the quay with the arrogance of a thing that has survived storms that would humble kings. She grinned at the sea and spat in it and made a sign that was half prayer and half insult. "We will do what we said," she shouted over the water. "We'll carry your timber, Snow Boy, and your grain, and if we take a fermented barrel for ourselves, you can send your great dog to bite my arse for it." She waved, the wave of a woman who had not asked permission in years, and the ship turned its sharpened prow toward open water with a movement that was more like thinking than like turning. The harbor emptied by degrees until its clutter was old boats and newer hopes. Jon had not realized how much the sight of the unsullied information had made his heart hold its breath until now, when the pier felt wider and the air sat easier in his lungs. He did not smile. He let himself stand and breathe and be a man who watched a departure and did not build a list in his head for a handful of heartbeats. "Come on," Davos said at last, tugging his cap down with a scowl at the sun. "There's a pair of Mason brothers from Duskendale who want to argue about arches, and I need you to nod at the right moments so they'll accept what I tell them later. Also, A prelate wants to know if you mean to rebuild his bloody sept before you rebuild a bridge that actual people walk across every day. I told him I'd ask the king. He paused. Regent, whatever shape of you doesn't catch in your throat today. We build the bridge, Jon said, because he could answer that, at least, and because he had seen a woman nearly drown in a shallow channel yesterday when her foot had found a brick well and stuck as the current tried to make an end of her. Then we build the well in the next ward. Then we repair the ovens where the bakers say they need them, not where the prelate thinks they look fine in his sermons. Davos said, satisfied as a man whose list had become smaller. And you'll need to let the Iron Bank know we're sending them lions instead of coppers, and they'll send a man to scowl about it, and I will enjoy not liking him in your name. Jon looked to where the horizon was a blade of bright steel. He did not love the sea, but it had a way of making even ash honest. Send them what we owe, he said. Then send what we do not owe but must pay. Davos grunted, which was agreement or a belly complaint. It was a language Jon had learned. They turned away from the water and toward the city that would keep them from eating or sleeping or forgetting. Ghost lifted his head and trotted beside them, a pale piece of winter that had consented to live among stones. The night had found its shape again. It had corners a man could learn and lanes that moved him from one problem to the next without getting him lost in an unlit ocean. Jon walked the wall with Ghost padding a pace ahead, the wolf's senses prying the dark open like a door. The stones were warm still from the day. They gave the soles of his boots a rare kindness. He could see the city as a map from here, not the fine kind of map with blue rivers and tiny, clever trees, but the real kind that had been drawn with water and soot and the breath of people sleeping. Candles burned behind shutters. Their light was a weakness a thief loved and a balm a mother needed, and no law had yet been imagined that could satisfy both. Jon counted them as if the number might tell him if the city lived or merely pretended at it. When a gust lifted, he could hear the river gnawing at the footings and the soft weeping of a child who would be comforted or left to cry, depending on how tired his mother was. He could smell a stew that had used onions and nothing else and a kind of bread that measured grain with grief. He could smell, too, a sharpened tension in the alley to his right, the way a man smells his own blood when it has been drawn. He stopped with his hand on the crenel, and Ghost stopped with him, ears pricked. Below, where the wall's shadow pooled in a pocket, a figure paused, then flowed back into the avenue with a speed that spoke of training and of fear. The city watch, what remained of it, went by in bronze that had been polished with river sand. Their captain, a woman from the fish market whose forearms could have wrung a man dry, looked up briefly and tipped her chin, and Jon returned the acknowledgement, small and sufficient. He watched the spot where the shadow had been a moment longer and felt the prickle in the back of his neck settle. Not tonight, then. Another night. There were always other nights for men who carried blades and grievances. You can't hunt a shadow by standing still, Arya said, and Jon did not start. He had learned again how to accept that she could be where he had not expected her. She came out of a turret as if she had been leaning there since before the wall was built. Her hands folded into sleeves, her hair braided to make someone else think she had stopped looking like herself. I am not hunting, Jon said. No, Arya agreed. You are waiting to be hunted, and pretending that is an entirely different activity. He huffed something that might have become a laugh if it had been fed. Do you mean to scold me, little sister? Do I ever? She said, and the answer lay between them like the spear a child leaves in the yard and a father steps over while keeping his dignity. She leaned on the Merlin and looked down into the city with him. When I leave, she said, as if they had been seasons talking about when the sun would go, I will be angry, not at you, at the leaving. Morning returned to them because it always did. The map room had been burned, and the dragon's back that covered the floor had been cracked by heat and boot and falling beam. They had laid rough boards where the black had gaped, and men tripped on the seam until their feet learned the new landscape. The knife points that held the new chain of grain routes were not elegant. They were knives because knives could be spared and pins could not. A man could live without a pin. He could not live without a knife. Sam turned pages with fingers that had a little more callus than they once had, and his ink smudged because he could not keep from resting his hand on his work when he thought. If we move the grain from Maidenpool up the Rose Road, we will be robbed 7 times by men who have just discovered that horses and hunger have made them brave. He drew a line. If we go by river with Davos's boats here and here and here, we will lose some to rot, and we will feed half of the Crownlands' villages on the way whether we mean to or not, and the other half will hate us for 3 years' worth of reasons. Men who know they will get bread if they do not take it will stand in line like everyone else, Davos said. Men who think this might be the last bread they see will take it from their sister's mouth. Give me a patrol of 20 who do not flinch and a signal horn, and I will brave your river bandits. The water has taught worse men manners. Brienne, Jon said. Set watches on the roads to keep order but not to pick fights. If a man takes a loaf because his child is hollow, let him keep it. If he takes a sack because he means to sell it, put him to carrying brick under guard until his back understands a scale he has forgotten. Brienne inclined her head. She had cleaned the mortar from her cheek and left a smear of ash on her neck. I will choose the watchers from among the ones who do not like to beat men. They have a talent for not having to. Yara, Sansa said without looking away from the map. What will you want for another month of your men and ships? A chance not to get bored, Yara said promptly. And timber and pitch, and the promise that when you decide to tax salt at a foolish rate you'll listen to me call you a fool before you do it. You'll call me a fool either way, Sansa said. The timber you shall have. The pitch we can spare. The hearing is yours until you spend it. Jon watched them, and the part of him that had learned to admire how a wall could be built out of men no one would have wagered on came to the table at last. Sam, he said, write to the Riverlands and the Westerlands not to send us men with banners but men with hands. We will pay them in food in that order. He stood for a time at the cracked window where once a queen had looked out and imagined the world kneeling. He did not imagine anyone kneeling. He imagined a street with its stones set true. He imagined a bridge whose planks did not flex under a cart's weight and a well whose water ran clear enough to show a face. He imagined a woman whose hands had been burned on an oven turning the loaf with those same hands and not flinching. He imagined his own life extending not as a banner but as a length of rope, used and knotted and useful, not pretty and enough. Ghost raised his head, sudden, and Jon felt the prickling that said something beyond the wall had remembered him. He did not reach for his sword. He placed his hands on the sill where the stone had been polished by men who had leaned here to watch the city fail and thrive for 100 years, and he let his palms learn its story. Then he turned, because that is what men of any use do when the next task comes. He did not know if he was a king. He knew the next task. He went to meet it. Frost whitened the blackened orchard, a dusting of grace on wood that would never leaf again. The King's Road was a leather strap in the sun, cracked and tough, running from wound to wound as if it could hold the realm together by tautness alone. Jon rode to the place where the road bent round a low rise and widened enough that men could face one another without bumping boots. Brienne rode on his right, Davos on his left with the watchfulness of a man who had learned to steer quarrels the way he had once steered ships along sandbars. Behind them, a file of Vale knights kept their lances upright with the habit of mountains in their shoulders. Ghost went ahead with the self-appointment of old companions. The Western riders came down out of the pale, their banner bleeding its color into the morning. Red Lion crossed by a band of black that told of mourning or shame or a herald's refusal to pretend. The city of the West had always turned toward the sea. Its streets ran downhill like children and ended in salt. Its people smelled of pitch in summer and of damp in winter. Songs had been written about its sunset light on the masts, though no one remembered all the words. A boatwright there could judge a man's honesty by the way he coiled rope. Now Lannisport bore the work of an exile with a craftsman's grimness. The cranes swung without flourish. The counters with their tablets laid pebbles with the disinterest nobles reserved for gossip. The watchers in gray and blue moved through the lines like a slow tide, counting the chests with taps that sounded like a heartbeat heard with the ear pressed to wood. Old Lady Rhea put her fingers in the water as if greeting an old friend before a long road and flinched, then laughed at herself. "It's only wet, girl," she scolded her own skin. Dawn made a wash of pearl along the quay. The water had the color of a thought that had not yet decided whether to be hopeful. The sloop Yara had bullied into a shape Arya would approve of rocked gently against its ropes like a horse guessing the rider to come. Arya stood with her hands in her sleeves and her weight on the balls of her feet, ready to move in any direction fate decided to fling at her for sport. Sansa was bareheaded. She held out a packet that had been wrapped to keep out weather and men's curiosity both. "Maps," she said. "Mostly wrong, but men comfort themselves by drawing lines and naming coasts, and perhaps there are truths hidden in their lies. There is also a pair of gloves I stole from you when we were girls, and a ribbon mother said made you look like a sheaf of wheat. You may throw that into the sea out of propriety, or wear it when you think of the hearth and want to feel that you are not a blade but a girl for a minute." Arya's face did the thing it did when she encountered tenderness, hesitation, the instinct to duck, and then the decision to endure it because it came from a source she trusted. She took the packet and slid it under her cloak. "I will send you a shell with a song. You will hate the song. You will play it twice in one night when you cannot sleep." Sansa touched her sister's cheek, quick as a sparrow. "Come back," she said, in a voice that did not tie the command to a time. "Or if you do not, send word that you went where you meant to." Arya turned to Jon. He had no gift for her but the things they had always traded, blunt truth and a kind of gentleness they did not dare bring into daylight most days. Ghost pressed his head to Arya's hip and received a scratch with a gravity more fitting to a champion knight being allowed to retire. "If a storm comes, go into it," Jon said. "Running from it makes it chase you longer." "I learned that with men before I learned it with weather," Arya said. She looked at him, at the lines grief had drawn into his face. "Do not make a prayer of your guilt. It will eat your bread and sleep in your bed and grow so fat you will call it by names to make yourself feel less a fool. I'll feed it bread heels and make it wait in the corridor," Jon said, and she laughed once. A small, honest bark that made Yara grin like a pirate saint. "You have rope and fresh water and a helm that isn't cursed," Yara said, clapping Arya's shoulder as if to test where the bones lay. "If you die, it will be because you did something interesting first. I approve." Arya went up the gangplank with the gait of a cat and the balance of someone who had walked narrower floating things in worse weather. She did not look back until she had to. When she did, it was not to fix anyone in her mind but to fix the shape of the harbor, the angle of the light, the call of the gull that sounded like a laugh. She lifted 2 fingers in a salute that had been taught by no one and by everything. The ropes came off. The sloop nosed into the current like a hound that had caught a cold scent and wanted to test it anyway. Jon stood until the sail had become a triangle on the gray, and then a smudge and then a possibility. He did not say her name. He knew it without speaking, which was enough. They had cut a new street where the old hill had been a theater of power. The new houses of worship were simple halls of stone with roofs that would not fall on a frightened child. The star carved over a lintel looked almost embarrassed, and perhaps that was good. Beside the hall, a bathhouse breathed steam into the chill and accepted all comers for a copper and the courage to undress in front of strangers, which was a kind of faith also. Men and women came out pink and human and walked easier, and the city learned the lesson a clean limb teaches a tired back. The prelate wore black that had ambitions toward velvet and a mouth that had ambitions toward rule. He held his hands as if they were full of fragile light and frowned at the bathhouse as if it were blasphemy that had somehow acquired a chimney. "Bread, yes," he said to Sam, who nodded with polite ferocity. "Bridges, of course," he conceded to Davos, who grunted as if he had just watched a man discover water. "But do you mean to set the Hall of the Seven equal to a place where men wash their feet? It is an insult to the mother and the stranger both." "It is an honor to the living," Sam said gently, "and the living become the dead in better moods if they are warm and clean first." Davos scratched his beard. "And a man who feels his skin again is more likely to believe the gods remember him. I've seen eyes change in steam, prelate. It makes men think kindly of the world, for a minute. Your prayers will land softer." Jon let them go on and then cut the line clean. "You will have your hall. You will not have my laws. If your God wishes to write them, he can come down and hold the quill. Until then, Men and women will wash their feet and go to your altar on their own." The prelate's mouth tightened into a paper cut. "The faith does not forget slights." "Nor do wolves," Brienne murmured, and the prelate decided wisely that the day might be better spent counting candles. They took the fused iron out of the hall bit by stubborn bit. It came away like old scabs and left clean stone under soot. Ladders multiplied until the air itself seemed to have rungs, and men walked them with the ease that comes from being too tired to think about fear. A new truss went up like a rib cage for a heart that had not been fitted yet. It would hold. It would have to. The chair Jon would not call a throne was set behind the table where his council laid knives as if they were pins. It was oak with joints that had been cut to meet and not to lie. He sat in it and felt it tell him the truth about his weight. Sansa stood before him not as a supplicant and not as a challenger, but as the person who shared his blood and his worst habits. Brienne stood to one side with Podrick behind her, who had become longer and less inclined to trip over his own earnestness. "The North must go home," Sansa said, not apologizing for it. "They do not like it here. Their bones do not like it. They are useful out of stubbornness. They will be useful in their own fields out of pride, which is a better fuel for a long winter." "Go," Jon said. "Leave what you can spare and send what you must keep. If anyone tells you to answer to a man who smells of harbor salt and thinks that makes him king of bears, remind him that the North chose and meant it, and that I said so." She tilted her head. "You will need a name that sticks to letters. If not king, then Lord Protector of the Realm," Sam said, as if reading from a history he had just finished writing in his head. "It does not require a crown. It requires lists and sleep given up and the knowledge that the best praise you will get will be that the bread was not late more than twice this week." Davos chuckled. "I've known worse honors." "Then take the ring," Sansa said, and produced from her cloak a plain band of iron and plated silver. "Not a crown, a reminder. You can leave it on a table without anyone thinking you have left the room." Jon looked at it, at the twist of metal that would be colder on a winter morning and warmer on a summer afternoon. He extended his hand, and Sansa slid the ring onto the forefinger, because she had always done things her own way. To fit, it would be easy to lose and easier to find. It would not catch in a man's hair or blind him in the sun. He flexed his hand and the ring pressed back and declared itself no more than it was. "Keep Arya's map in your pocket," Sansa said softly, so that only he heard. "When men try to chain you with their own fear, look at it and remember there is a place with no lines at the edge. You will feel the knot loosen." "I will," Jon said. Brienne bowed, an economy of grace. "I will see the Queen in the North safe to the neck. Then I will return. There are boys here in borrowed mail who think a sword is a friend. I can teach them to treat it like a tool. Some of them will live to be men if I do it well." Podrick's smile was a quick sunrise. "And I can make them laugh when they think they cannot stand another hour." "You can," Brienne agreed with a ghost of a smile. "And sing off key until they beg you to stop and not realize another watch has gone by while they suffered." Gendry arrived with a sack of iron hooks over his shoulder, and the hall brightened by a degree simply because he came as if he belonged in any room that smelled of work. "Hooks for pulleys," he said. "We'll raise your beams and not swear too much doing it. Storm's End is sending carpenters because they see a city and smell coin. I told them they'd be paid in bread and the chance to build something that wouldn't fall on them. They said that would do." "Good," Jon said, and the word covered more ground than one syllable should. There were nights when the city wanted something that was not bread and not law. On such a night, the river carried paper lanterns like tame stars. Each had a name inked by a hand that had loved the person named. The water took them into its black and did not extinguish them immediately. The flames made small paths on the current. The children ran along the quay and tried to follow their lights as if by running they could keep pace with memory. Gilly shushed little Sam when he made the delighted sound a child makes at fire, which was not the same as the sound he made at warmth, and Sam watched his son's face and the river, and his own face contained more kinds of hope than it had when he had been a boy who read in empty towers. Davos stood with Jon and did not try to fill the quiet. After a time, because it is unkind not to offer a man words when he needs them, he said, "You did right to send the lions out in boats instead of coffins. The sea will take their roars down to the bottom and grind them until they're sand. The wind will carry the grit and set it in a mortar tray for some mason who has no use for songs." Jon breathed, and the breath did not hurt his chest as much as it had. "The riders?" he asked, because there was always a next list. "Have not returned," Davos said, "which is as good a sign as you get in this world. The Iron Banks man sent us a cask of a wine he claims is real. Probably is. He wants us drunk when we sign something in 6 moons. We'll drink it anyway, because it will warm the hands that held those lanterns, and that is worth more than getting one over on a man whose dinnerware costs more than a skiff. And the faith, building their hall without statues taller than the men who pray in front of them," Davos said. "That prelate looks at me like a cat that's learned a new word and isn't sure if it's a blessing or a trap. I like him better when he scowls. I understand scowls. Smiles are expensive." A gust flipped the ledger open on the stone landing. Jon caught a loose page with his palm. His name was not in the book, no tally gave him to anyone. That comforted him for reasons he did not care to find the shape of. He set the page back with the others and placed a small stone on the stack. A boy skipped by and stumbled, and Jon reached a hand without thinking and steadied him. And the boy turned, saw who had helped, and did a double-take so honest that Jon laughed. And the boy laughed with him and then ran on, forgetting him as completely as he would have forgotten any other stone he had not tripped over. They went out to meet the road, because a road that only brings trouble in is a road that will betray you. They traveled light, Brienne, 2 of the city watch whose eyes missed nothing, a quiet maester with a bandage on his wrist from an oven burn he had insisted on treating himself, and a handful of good riders who knew how to take a message without spilling it. Rain kept pace with them like a dog that cannot decide whether it is friendly. They stopped for stew and the kind of bread that fills the mouth with damp comfort. The teamsters at the next table argued about axle grease and politics as if they could be solved by the same rag, which, in Jon's experience, they could. A messenger came in flashed by the rain with a parchment bearing 2 seals mashed together by a hasty hand. He wiped his face on his sleeve and bowed to the room, which is to say he bowed to anyone who might give him something hot to drink. Jon broke the seals with a care that said it had taken him time to learn not to tear paper in his impatience. Lord Edmure Tully had written like a man who had discovered that being alive after making a fool of himself in a field of witnesses is a task that can be undertaken after all. He pledged the Riverlands bridges and carpenters and a patience learned by standing on banks waiting for floods to subside. Jon Royce had added his hawk in a wax that had found its discipline under mountains. The Vale would send grain and men who could read a cliff and a ledger. They did not ask who wore a crown. They asked whom they should send their carpenters to report to on arrival. Jon felt the thread loosen in his chest again. The one Sansa had named, the one Arya had promised a shell for. He wrote on the back of the letter with the stump of a quill, his words shorter than the ones sent to him and therefore heavier. Send to Davos. Bring plumbobs and patience. Do not expect applause. He folded the letter the way he preferred to fold problems, along the line that would keep them from spilling. The messenger sopped stew with a crust and grinned at Jon's coin as if it were a miracle that miracles could be practical, and the fire cracked and Ghost slept, and for a battered hour the world was the size of a roadhouse full of damp men and the sound of rain. The city remembered how to produce a knife with a message. It sent one in the hands of a man who had been made into an instrument by someone meaner and less brave. He waited in the curve of a stair where footsteps announced themselves like arguments. He damped his breath the way a boy dampens tears when he hears his father's boots. He had imagined the shape of the thrust so many times that his arm twitched to match the image. A lantern turned the corner before the man he wanted. It belonged to a watchwoman with shoulders like a dock post and a truncheon that had once been part of a ship's railing. Her lantern made his face into a story that did not flatter him. He moved because habit is stronger than sense. She swung because another habit is to live. The knife went into a bucket someone had left under a drip. The bucket clanged. Ghost's eyes opened in the dark beyond, and the man froze in a kind of awe that has nothing to do with gods and everything to do with teeth. John arrived to the sound of the bucket, finding contentment after alarm. He looked at the watchwoman, who had the grace not to look triumphant, and at the would-be murderer, who had the sense to look tired. "Who sent you?" John asked. The man swallowed. He was not brave enough to lie for long and not brave enough to tell the truth quickly. "A name with coin," he said at last. "A cat with a scar. A woman who said the lion has friends who prefer their favors bought with blood." John did not ask for more. The city would tell him in its own time where the coin had been minted, and Arya had taught him that pulling on a thread too hard snaps it before the garment can be mended. He nodded to the watchwoman. "Take him to a cell that does not stink of the last man who occupied it. Feed him. Let him think about how light looks through a window when you are not sure you will see it again. He will speak tomorrow." The watchwoman saluted with her truncheon, an unlovely and excellent gesture. "Aye." Ghost breathed out. The man sagged. John stood there a moment longer, learning again that rule is a house with thin walls, and then went to his bed where sleep waited like a half-tamed dog that will come if you do not call it by name. The sea does not care about decrees. It took the third convoy west with the absent-minded malice of an old god awakening from a nap. The squall came with a wall of rain and a tongue of wind that licked the decks clean of loose men. Lanterns went wild, describing arcs of madness. The captain bellowed and the crew bellowed back, and the ship bellowed in its own tongue, which was the language of timbers that have been asked too much for too long. Ser Martin sat in a corner of the hold with Ellen wrapped in a cloak that smelled of old apples and new fear. He told her a story about a woman who had taught a stone to float by telling it gently that water was only sky turned upside down. Ellen stared at him with the fierce belief of children in the middle of larger noises and believed him long enough to stop shivering. Her lion charm was a small star between them. A barrel broke loose and fetched up against a rib with a bang that would have broken a man's shin if it had chosen a different path. A sailor cursed creatively and was rebuked by an old woman who had given birth twice in rougher weather and had no patience for men teaching the air bad habits. Yara's longship came up on their quarter like a shark grinning. She shouted something rude at the storm and then shouted something clever at the helmsman, and the two thoughts seemed to agree because the ship found the right line through the rack and took the brunt like a warrior who has realized the blow is coming and chooses to lean into it. The squall passed as squalls do, in a decision that had nothing to do with the creatures that suffered under it. The stout little carrack shook itself the way a dog does after a bad dream. The lanterns settled. Ellen fell asleep with her fist clenched around her lion and her mouth open, trusting the sea because she had been told to and because exhaustion is a kind of faith. There is a morning when scaffolding begins to descend and a city sees the shape it has been building and discovers that, almost against its will, it has made something that will hold rain and look almost handsome after a scrub. Bells ring, testing themselves cautiously. The well buckets squeal with clean pulley grease. Children chalk squares and hop with the graceless grace of those who have not yet learned shame and will be the worse for it when they do. A street singer strums cleverly around the edges of a song he has promised not to play and finds that the other songs are not as satisfying and learns to make them so. In the hall, the oak chair waited like a workbench. John stood before it and looked at the grain of the wood and the small scars where a carpenter's chisel had slipped and not been sanded away to make a lie. Davos came with a bundle of petitions tied with string pilfered from some useful place. Marriages, he said. Disputes over lines that moved when the fire took the house between two men who do not like each other and cannot remember why. A request to allow a troupe of players to perform a farce about a king who will not sit on his own chair. I told them they could perform it in the fishmonger's lane, because they like to throw rotten things there and it will save us cartage. John took the stack which had the weight of a good loaf. We will hear them, he said. All of them, not because they are all important, because some are, and we will not know which by the seals on the strings. Sam arrived with ink on his cheek and news in his hand. A raven from Old Town, he said. They disagree with your refusal to allow their representative to declare within the city walls who is and is not a legitimate recorder of knowledge. They would like a house for their order near the new Hall of the Seven. He smiled in a way that contained mischief and mild malice. I told them they could have a room in the bathhouse if they liked steam so much. Tell them to send healers, John said. Not judges. If they want to bind books, they can teach 3 girls from Flea Bottom to read and write as payment for every crate of parchment they bring. I will give them a roof once those girls have copied a prayer and a recipe properly. Sam's eyes lit. It will horrify them. It will help us, John said. The city will not be ruled by men who think a key is a weapon to keep in a pocket. If knowledge is food, we will not dole it with bent spoons. Davos shuffled the petitions to the topmost. This one will please you, he said. A request from the masons to carve a relief over the new hall's door. Not a dragon, not a wolf, a bread oven and a bridge, with a fish and a rope tucked in a corner where only men who look will see. Approve it, John said, and felt something like lightness pass through him and almost stay. When the riders returned at last, they were fewer, not because they had been cut down, but because a task had been finished, and tasks eat men in quiet ways. Their banners were furled as if in recognition that the road prefers to see a man without his theater. Adam Marbrand rode to the same bend where they had first met. He had a small coffer belted at his side. He dismounted with a grunt that told the truth about years and opened the box to show a ledger bound in cracked hide. Names of those gone across, he said simply. By household, by chest. Those who married into other names and are staying with writs. Children fostered with kin under oath. The dead who could not wait for ships and were burned on pyres built with a better patience than we had when we built fires before. And here, he held up a small pouch that clinked prettily. Coin taken by a militia captain at the Corkscrew Bridge who thought to tax the West with nostalgia and his own desperation. His men ate better for 2 days. Their guilt will last longer. The money goes back to the road. John took the ledger. He felt the virtue of it, a thing made dull by labor and therefore useful. He nodded once. Thank you. Adam glanced past him to where a kite made of sackcloth chased wind across a field, its tail stitched with scraps of linen from ruined shirts. 2 children shouted at it with joy and wrath in equal measure. It is a strange thing, he said, to leave so much and feel lighter. I thought I would hate you. I do not. That may come later, as hatred does, for reasons I cannot predict. For now, he lifted a shoulder. For now, I am a man with a list and a place to bring it. That is better than any of the songs we used to sing. If you write me from across the sea, I will read it, John said. If you ask me for bread, I will weigh the request with the others. If you send knives, I will meet them with iron rather than words. We are not friends. We are men trying to keep our people standing up. Adam's mouth turned in something that might, in a kinder world, have become a smile. A fair statement. May your bridges stand. May your ovens draw. May your voyages not turn you into the worst version of yourself, John said, surprising them both. They parted without blessing. The kite tugged free of a little hand and snapped its line and went up with a laugh the children did not mean to give it. Brienne caught the string without moving her feet much and handed it back with a nod that contained a small instruction and a promise that she would not always be there to make the catch. The boy took it and tried again. The kite went up and held. The wind made its own decisions, as always.